If you're like me, as you start getting into your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, you start to worry about the prospect of dementia later in life. And we often think of this in fatalistic terms. If my grandmother got it and my father got it, then that's it. I'm probably going to get it. And I remember thinking more along those lines myself, but reading the scientific research has completely changed how I think of dementia. The Lancet Commission on Dementia reported that 45%, nearly half, of all dementia cases worldwide can be prevented with specific modifiable factors, not genetic destiny, not bad luck, things that you can actually change. And in 2024, they added 2 new factors that they think have gathered enough evidence to justify being put on the list. And most people are not being told about this. So we're going to go through all of that. Now, the reason I make these videos is most of the content out there on this topic is not that helpful. They're either trying to sell you a supplement or scare you or giving you silly lists of 5 foods that are going to change your brain today. I think we all know that's not how this works. Yes, food and diet matters. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but you want to get the full picture. So we'll go over the key risk factors that matter most for you specifically. Obviously, we can't go back in time. We can't change the education we got as kids. We can't change our genetics. And those things matter. We're not going to pretend they don't. But if you're watching this video, chances are you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, and that's exactly when we have the most power to change our future, the window of time you're in right now. So we'll focus on 5 risk factors that are modifiable and that are more surprising. There are some other things on that list that we already know, like smoking, alcohol, obesity. We're not going to spend too much time on those. We'll focus on 5 factors that are less well known and that you have the power to change today. And we'll go over a landmark trial that surprised a lot of people, surprised even us scientists, and that directly contradicts what a lot of people believe about dementia. And we'll wrap up with the one thing I would prioritize above all else if I could give you just one action from this whole video. So here's the first factor. Most people, when they think of dementia, think of things in the brain, amyloid plaques, tau protein, something going wrong inside your skull. And that's not wrong, but it's incomplete. Your brain accounts for only 2% of your body weight, but 20% of your blood flow. It just guzzles energy. And so if the little blood vessels that feed your brain are damaged, brain cells can't get the nutrients and the oxygen they need. When your blood pressure is too high, and I'm talking about a sustained elevation, right? Hypertension, not a one-time high value at the doctor's office. Your blood vessels are damaged over time and plaque builds faster. This is the exact same process that narrows your coronary arteries and can lead to a heart attack, except here it's the arteries that feed the brain. And so the neurons, the brain cells that depend on that blood flow, they start to starve. And you might notice some differences. You might notice that you're getting more forgetful, but at first you dismiss that as normal aging. But that is not normal aging. That is vascular injury that accumulates over years. Untreated hypertension during midlife is one of the scariest risk factors for dementia, precisely because it happens under the surface, while we feel just fine. So here's what that means for you personally. If your blood pressure has been running high throughout your 40s, 50s, 60s, you're not just at higher risk of a heart attack or a stroke, you're also opening the door to dementia later in life. Okay, so how do we fix it? Number 1, know your numbers. Blood pressure is a simple measurement, and it's one of the most modifiable risk factors on this list. And we got a whole video on tips to lower blood pressure, the best foods, the best workouts. So I'll link that in the end. Now, the next factor surprises a lot of people because it's got nothing to do with blood vessels, and we often don't connect it to dementia. And that's losing your hearing or losing your vision. In fact, hearing loss is one of the strongest risk factors on the whole Lancet list. When your hearing worsens, your brain has to work harder. It has to allocate resources just to fill in the gaps, just to try to understand what people are saying. And that means fewer resources left for other tasks like memory or decision-making or whatever else. So you're not just losing your hearing, you're also losing cognitive reserves that you're going to need later in life. And hearing loss leads to social withdrawal. People stop going to parties, stop going to dinners, because it's exhausting and it's embarrassing. You can't follow a conversation. And so people isolate. And social isolation is its own factor on the list. And we'll come to that in a minute. So that's why they consider hearing loss one of the strongest factors on the list. It has multiple pathways leading to dementia. On a personal note, my own mother has lost a lot of hearing over the years. And so I made sure to get her a really high quality hearing aid precisely because I was worried about this prospect of dementia. And the truth is, it's made a huge difference. It's a lot easier for her to communicate with me, with everybody else. So she ends up being much more social with the device. So if you notice any hearing loss, even if you're still relatively young, I recommend getting a full hearing assessment from an audiologist. And these tests, a lot of times they are free. You can get them at many different centers. And then we have the other side of the sensory loss, which is vision loss, where you start to struggle to read, to use a cell phone, to watch a movie, to watch TV. So you're shut out from a lot of the world and a lot of learning sources. Vision loss was one of the two new factors that the Lancet Commission added to the list in 2024. And we'll look at the other one in a second. Now, the next factor doesn't require any equipment or test, but it's the most emotionally difficult on this whole list. Social isolation. Chronic loneliness is associated with higher cortisol levels. Cortisol is your stress hormone. And cortisol is toxic for your hippocampus, the region of your brain that plays a central role in memory formation. So the hippocampus is literally shrinking under that consistent stress of social isolation. And to make matters worse, socially isolated people are less likely to eat well, to exercise, to seek medical care. So everything tends to get worse. If you're watching this and you or someone else in your life has become more isolated over the years, maybe you're retired or spouse passed away or kids grew up, moved to a different country, this is important. The cognitive damage from that isolation is very real, but the recovery from reconnecting is also real. So it's not too late. Just start simple. Give someone you haven't talked to in a while a phone call. This is something I'm working on myself. Sometimes I just work too much and I forget to socialize. So I carve out time, make sure that I give someone a phone call or go grab coffee or go to an exhibit or whatever, because this is important. Now, I know we're going over a lot of information, so let's talk about a landmark trial that ties a lot of this together and that might change your social habits, maybe your eating habits, and then we'll wrap up with the one thing you can do today. Remember that landmark trial I mentioned in the beginning of the video? Well, they actually used social activity. They included that in their intervention. So let's talk about it because it has changed how we think about preventing dementia. So this was a randomized trial conducted in Finland with over 1,200 participants aged 60 to 77, all at risk of cognitive decline, all at risk of dementia. The participants were split randomly. Half of them received general health advice, just standard of care. The other half went through an extensive program with 5 components. Healthy diet, similar to a traditional Mediterranean diet, high in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, limiting added sugars and alcohol, moderate in salt, and favoring healthy fats. Fish a couple times a week, and they used canola oil, which is more popular in the north of Europe as opposed to olive oil, which is more popular in the south. Then they had an exercise component, which included both cardio and strength training. Third was a cognitive training component, so some memory exercises, some reasoning exercises as well. Fourth was social activity, as you said. So they made sure the participants had regular meetings where they interacted with each other to make sure they were exercising that social muscle as well. And the final component, the fifth component, was managing their health parameters. So they met with a nurse and a doctor, and they had their blood pressure, their BMI, their waist circumference measured, and they also got some advice to improve on those. After 2 years on the program, their cognitive performance improved 25% more than the control group that just got the general health advice. And these gains were especially clear in two specific domains. Executive function, which is the ability to plan, to focus, to make decisions, that improved 83% more than the controls. And processing speed, which is the ability to receive information and respond to it quickly in real time, that improved by 150% more than the controls. And the cool thing about this trial is they kept following the participants years after the trial was officially over. And 5 years later, 5 years after the trial wrapped up, they still saw a difference, still saw an advantage cognitively for the folks that went through the program. And when they compared the folks that stuck the best to the advice, the best adherent to the worst adherent during the trial, they saw a difference, an advantage up to 9 years after the end of the trial. So very interesting results. Now, all of this is impressive, but the part that surprised people the most was when the investigators looked at participants with different genetics, because those data directly contradict how a lot of people think and what a lot of people believe about dementia. So we're going to look at that in detail next. First, I just want to acknowledge some limitations of this trial real quick, because in science, we want to look at the strongest evidence, but we also want to acknowledge areas of uncertainty. First, remember that the trial changed a lot of different things, right? Diet and exercise and social activity. So we don't really know which component or which combination of components deliver the results. The trial can't tell us that. Just that the full program seemed beneficial. Also, dementia typically develops over long time spans, many years, decades even. So a trial that lasts 2 years, even with that follow-up, always leaves some question marks as far as long-term. All of that said, really interesting, really encouraging results from this trial that show that we can change how our brain works, our cognitive capacity, pretty quickly over a couple of years, just with habits that are achievable by most people. Now, the scientists asked, does this still work even for people who have a higher risk of dementia? Carriers of the ApoE4 gene, they have a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. So does this type of intervention still work for those folks? Now, this is what we call an exploratory analysis. It's not part of the original trial, so we have to be a little cautious with these results, but it still provides interesting information. And not only did the intervention work for those folks, there was actually a trend towards a stronger improvement in that group. So this is really worth taking a second and thinking about, because it goes directly against what a lot of people believe about dementia. Having bad genetics, having a rough family history doesn't mean our fate is sealed. It doesn't mean we throw up our hands, right? If anything, it makes these habits even more important. So this trial really made a dent in the field, because we're now beyond just correlations. This is an intervention. Changing our lifestyle affects not just our physical health, but also our brain health. Okay, but let's go back to the 5 factors, because there are 2 that we haven't covered yet. Your blood sugar level affects your heart, affects your kidneys, but it also affects your brain. When your blood sugar is consistently high, like we see in people with diabetes, for example, that excess glucose in your blood binds to different molecules and causes glycation. It causes damage of your blood vessels. And the small vessels that feed the brain are especially sensitive to this. So here's what that means for you and your body. You want to know your hemoglobin A1C, also known as glycated hemoglobin. This is a 3-month average of your blood sugar levels. And so if your hemoglobin A1C is consistently elevated, those small blood vessels feeding your brain are being damaged silently without you noticing anything. So you want to make some changes. In fact, before you're in the diabetes range, if it's over 5.7% hemoglobin A1C, you're in pre-diabetes range, and it's worth making some changes before things deteriorate further. We also have a whole video on lowering hemoglobin A1C with healthy habits, with best foods and everything. So I'll link that in the end as well. Now let's look at the last factor. And this is another one. This is the second one that was added in 2024 by the Lancet Commission. Plaque in our arteries is caused by these microscopic little particles that float around in our blood. And scientists sometimes use a blood test called LDL or LDL cholesterol to estimate the number of these particles in our bloodstream. It's not the cleanest metric. It's pretty imperfect, but it's often used because most people have gotten their LDL cholesterol measured a bunch of times. So in 2024, the Lancet Commission added high LDL cholesterol to their list of risk factors for dementia. This is not about diet debates, diet wars. People who have more of these particles in circulation, whether it's diet-induced or genetically induced, have more plaque. So the arteries supplying the brain tend to narrow, and it causes vascular dementia. And the good news is this process is completely preventable, and we know how to do it using the exact same tools that stop heart disease. If you've never gotten a full lipid panel, I recommend doing that, getting not just the LDL cholesterol and triglycerides, but also getting your ApoB and your Lp(a) measured. Those two values are more reliable. They're more accurate representations of your risk of heart disease than your LDL cholesterol. So when in doubt, I recommend looking at those. I check these metrics myself, and for my family members, I measure ApoB, I measure Lp(a), I measure hemoglobin A1C. I respect these metrics because the evidence overwhelmingly supports their importance and because we have the power to change them. We can change our future. And that brings us to the last section here and the single most important thing I want you to take away from this entire video. Everything we know about dementia and preventing dementia was perfectly summed up by the scientist who oversaw that landmark trial we talked about. Professor Mia Kivipelto of the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. She said, what is good for your heart is also good for your brain. So I'm going to share with you what I personally do to avoid dementia, and then we'll wrap up with an actionable plan that you can implement today. I check my blood pressure regularly. I have a device at home. I look at it maybe a couple times a month. That's better than having it measured once a year at the doctor's office, which sometimes is unreliable. We have a whole video on how to measure blood pressure properly at home or not, and all the mistakes that people often make, including doctors. So I'll link that in the description. I make sure to exercise most days. I often don't feel like going, not going to lie to you, but I push myself and I end up going 3 to 5 days a week. I've never regretted going to the gym. I only regret the workouts I miss. I do some cardio and I also do weights at the gym. I remember when I was in grad school working towards my PhD, reading something that really blew my mind, that physical activity is actually more powerful to prevent dementia than brain activity. Obviously, you want to do both, but physical activity is actually more powerful for brain health than brain activity, right? Puzzles or learning something. So that's kind of mind-blowing. I also realized recently that I wasn't doing much cardio at the gym because it's boring to run on a treadmill staring at a wall. So I started going for walks first thing, 15, 20-minute walk around the neighborhood, and I do that almost every day. And I also just bought a bike recently, so I'm going to start doing more bike rides as well. I'm pretty careful about my diet. It's not fundamentally different from the diet they used in that trial, pretty similar on the basics. I get blood work, as I said, every so often, maybe a couple times a year. I look at ApoB, Lp(a) once. You don't need to measure that one all the time. Fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C. There's many others, but I would say those are the main ones. I also decided I'm going to get my hearing assessed soon. At my age, most people don't worry about it, but I'll go in, I'll take the free test. If it's normal, great, good news. Now, there's one part that's easy for me and one part that's harder. Cognitive training is naturally embedded into my life, reading, studies, interpreting. Even my hobbies are nerdy. I like to play chess. I love to read. I like to study Japanese. So the cognitive training is naturally there. I don't need to worry too much about that. And social interaction, as we said, I would say that's my weak spot right now out of all the factors. So I make a conscious effort to fit that in because it's important. This is the key, guys. Those consistent, not flashy, boring, but evidence-based habits that are really going to deliver the goods in the long run. So let's wrap up with a specific action plan. This is what I would tell a family member who asked me for one thing above all else that he or she can do today. Start with your cardiovascular risk factors: blood pressure, blood sugar or hemoglobin A1C, and cholesterol/ApoB. Not because everything else doesn't matter, but because these three are measurable, they're modifiable, and the evidence linking them to dementia is very strong. And next, you can add regular exercise. Even a daily walk can be a pretty good start. That's it. That's the daily plan. You want to start simple. Everything else we covered absolutely matters, but this is the entry point. Get tested, know your numbers, start working on fixing those. And we got videos on each of those aspects. I'll link the one on lowering hemoglobin A1C on the screen here in a second. The others, how to lower ApoB, how to lower blood pressure, I'll link below. If you have a parent in their 60s, in their 70s, or someone who would benefit from this information, please share it with them. We don't sell anything. We don't sell supplements, programs. We turn down every sponsor. The only thing we care about is that this information gets to people who need it. Here's that video on the best foods to lower hemoglobin A1C. I'll meet you in there. Take care.